Welcome to the Media Roundtable, where we explore the business of trust in the new media economy. I'm your host, Dan Granger. I'm the CEO of Oxford Road, and we're very much on topic in this episode, just talking about the future of trust in the new media economy, because in podcasting specifically, there's been a big gap, and there's a lot of trust in the creators and the voices who make podcasts, but there's not a lot of trust in the technical infrastructure in the industry. And so this week is a big one because last week we released something called the AMP Accords. It was the first in a long time serious attempt to get the industry together around a table to agree on some basic measurement standards. This was not just an Oxford Road initiative, although Oxford Road convened AMP, which is the Alliance for Measurement in Podcasting. It was a coalition, and we had task force members around the table who don't normally sit together. We had some of the leading platforms, players, that where you go to consume your shows. We had some of the leading publishers, networks. We had some of the leading advertisers. We had measurement leadership. We had agency leadership. And so we really tried to get a good cross-section of the industry with some standards. And we were able to do that. We were able to release last week what we called the AMP Accords, and that was a published document that is now available for you to download at ampaccords.com. This was done, like I said, a lot of people involved in this. My primary technical partner on this was Giles Martin, who's part of Oxford Road. He joined me in sitting down with James Cridland on his show last week to talk about the Accords, what they are, why they were important, and some of the technical, but also some of the strategic reasons for and against bringing something like this to market. And, you know, we expected James to poke holes and to challenge us. And I think he did a fair amount of that, but it'll be interesting to see what you make of the conversation. For years, this business just could not agree on what it is. We have had no standard adhered to definition of a podcast. We've had no standard for what an impression is if somebody's actually engaging with the content, whether it's visually and audibly or just listening. And we haven't been able to agree on a way to attribute ad performance in a standardized way, depending on where it gets distributed. So this was our answer to all three of those questions. And it's for everybody. The AMP Accords are for you, the Alliance for Measurement in Podcasting, wherever you sit around the table. We had somebody that represents your interests that was at that table. And we hope that it makes the whole industry more successful. We believe this is the best thing for nobody, which makes it the best thing for everybody, because it was the result of tensions between different stakeholders and where they were able to compromise and to align on solutions. And we think that there's major opportunity in this, whether you buy, sell, or make podcasts. This one is for you. So enjoy the conversation. I'm Dan Granger. I'm the CEO of Oxford Road.
And I am Giles Martin, the SVP of Strategy and Measurement at Oxford Road.
We don't make it easy on him. We just assign arbitrary titles and flip them around
once every 3 months.
It's a lot to keep up with.
So many congratulations to you both. Dan, why did you pull this group together, and what were you hoping to achieve with it?
I've given my whole career to this industry. It's got so much potential. It's got so much possibility. But I think we're holding ourselves back and doing something that I don't think anybody that pursues any commercial interest should ever be doing, which is frustrating our customers. And we do not make it easy to do business in this field. I think there was a long time that there was a question about whether or not this whole concept of a podcast, this term a podcast, was here to stay, or was it just going to be washed away and swept into another type of media? And I think in the last couple of years, we've learned that that's not happening anytime soon. And it's time that we take ourselves seriously and we create some legitimate standards that make it a little bit easier for all of us to do our jobs. You know, I think there are a lot of people that are approaching this in a lot of different ways and are interested in this. But I thought from where we sit in the industry, we had an opportunity to maybe bring people together in a new way, and try to see if we could take a run at this thing and move the ball down the field a little further.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about the group that you put together a year ago now is that there are a lot of people that historically haven't necessarily had too much of a look into this area. And we were talking with Martin Boytosh from Podmasters last week, and he said,
when advertisers drive change, it tends to happen.
And I thought that was a really interesting viewpoint in terms of this. So the document that you released this week, let's start with the definition of a podcast. Why was the definition of a podcast important, Dan?
There's a few reasons. The definition, I believe, has changed for how people use the term podcast, and I think we needed something that reflects the present day definition, but really it matters in a commercial sense. It doesn't matter if you're a consumer. A podcast is whatever you want it to be. I don't have a dog in that fight. I don't think any of us do. The consumer will tell us what they want a podcast to mean, and we can do with that what we will. But for those of us that are in the business, most of the revenue in this industry, and for those of us who keep the lights on with this industry, not having a definition has real financial consequences, because what happens is buying agencies or brands that buy the space, they end up with a channel that gets stuck in a no man's land. Nobody's quite sure who owns it. Is it audio's problem, radio's problem, social's problem? I see people talking about podcasting. It sits with their offline division.
Yeah.
And here we are trying to fancy ourselves digital, right? The consequence of that is we actually will see some advertisers pulling away from sponsoring content because it's just too much work to figure out how to get into it and whose problem it is. And so I think that if we're going to be in a multi-billion-dollar industry and expect it to grow, and we want to decide what the total revenue of that industry is, and we want investments in infrastructure and private equity and venture capital and things that we need to help fuel everything that we do to continue, at some point we're going to have to figure out what the hell is a podcast and maybe have some agreement. So I think we wanted something that would be useful, that would honor the origins of what podcasting was, that many of us came into it to pursue, but that would be realistic about where it lives today and where it's likely to go, and make space for that so we could have something to work with when we're doing business and know what it is we're truly buying and selling.
Yeah, because if we don't know what a podcast is, we can't turn around and say, well, podcasting is a $2.9 billion industry in the US if we don't actually know what we're defining there. So I think this is a super helpful thing to do. There is a long form definition which uses lots of fancy words, but there's a shorthand version which I really like. If it works with your eyes closed, it's a podcast. That to me is super simple and super easy. And I think it's the first time that I've seen that shorthand version, Dan. Has that been useful to help people understand what a podcast is?
Well, I think it is, because I was worried that you were going to ask me what the definition we landed on is, and then I'd have to go look it up, because it's definitely too technical to remember, for me anyway, every word of.
A podcast is an on-demand show rooted in the spoken word and fully intelligible as audio. Typically episodic and conversational, podcasts cover wide-ranging themes and formats. They are accessed as audio or video via open RSS feeds and other distribution methods.
You've been describing it, I think, in a very parallel way, which is something for your ears to do when your eyes are busy. And I think what we're all trying to get at is, like, what's the standard? What's the burden of proof to say this qualifies as a podcast? I think having a shorthand that somebody could hear and see and then say and retain gets the spirit of what we're trying to do a little further down the field. And then when we really truly need something technical, we now have that, and which is something I'm happy to get into as well, because I think there were a couple active debates going on in our industry that we tried to settle through this process.
Yeah, and there's a good table in the document, which is how to apply that definition, and I think that that's a good thing to go and have a look at. That's clearly part of what the AMP Accords is there for, and I think that this is a really helpful thing. But then, of course, we have definitions of how people are consuming podcasts, and more technical stuff about audience exposure. Giles, there is a definition in here of a play, and that's a relatively simple definition, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It was not quite as simple as it might seem getting to this simple definition. And we did have a lot of conversations about different variations on this that had more qualifiers. And as you might imagine, the more qualifiers you put in, the more that sort of opens up possibilities for different parties having sort of different points of view or different interests on it. And so it's perhaps inevitable that we landed on something as simple as this. But yes, we landed on...
A play occurs when a user consumes at least 30 consecutive seconds of a podcast, whether audio or video.
I mean, one thing, for example, that comes to mind immediately is, there's no parameter there for a window with which that will qualify. So might that be within 24 hours? Might that be within a session? These are the types of things that sort of we discussed. And in the end, I mean, I think personally I was a little disappointed, but perhaps understandably in the end, it was just not easy to get to a sort of definitive answer on this. And perhaps when this makes its way into the market and perhaps to the IAB ultimately, that might be something that gets further clarified or codified. But for now, at least that's sort of a good starting point. And it was really excellent, I think, for at least us who are working on the task force to see, Spotify announced relatively recently that they were going to adopt this 30-second standard for their plays. I think, perhaps when we were chatting separately, James, you had observed, or maybe in your newsletter, I think, YouTube obviously have a view standard, which I'm not sure if it is sort of explicit anywhere, but I think it's fairly generally understood to be a sort of 30 seconds with perhaps some of their own, tech and qualifiers for, invalid traffic, and, all these things that they do to qualify consumption. But, with Spotify and YouTube both being in that ballpark, I mean, that's, I think, very meaningful for the industry and perhaps encouraging for others to adopt that, and perhaps also encouraging for the rest of the accords in the sense that, it's already parts of it are getting some meaningful traction seemingly. So,
I think that's a very helpful thing. I mean, what's to ask the stupid question, what is wrong with a download?
Well, I think it was always somewhat problematic for those of us that were paying attention to these things. That said, I mean, for most of podcasting's life cycle, it's not really mattered that much because I think we all just accepted that the download was the currency. But I think as video has come in, it's just a different type of consumption. It's a different type of content. It's a different type of distribution. And it's very different from a download, which is just data being sent to your device so that you can play the podcast later on. And in many cases, that content ends up not being played. And so with this new video era where all of these metrics, a view or a stream or a play are, reporting something quite different from a download, that's where I think the issue has really been forced for the industry. And one of the reasons that the time is right for this type of work that we've undertaken here.
James, you've seen it since the beginning. Who's been funding the industry? 15 years ago, it was Amazon affiliate links that, Adam Carolla or whoever would say, make sure you use the link, go to my website, click the banner and go buy stuff on Amazon. And that we'll get a share of that. And that was how they funded the shows a lot of times.
Yeah.
And then we start getting into the advertising world. 2010, 11, 12, around the time we started coming into the picture, you could actually start to monetize. But who was buying that? It was all direct-to-consumer, kind of e-commerce, disruptive brands that cared about one thing, which was ad performance. What they didn't care about was a verifiable impression. They didn't really care about a CPM. And this whole business, I think, was built for a decade on the backs of companies that were looking at performance outcomes and not buying, kind of flying by control as you do when you're buying impressions. And so the industry has gotten to a place now where it's time for the big brands to come in. There's consolidation. Oxford Road is a great example of that, where we've consolidated. We have a bigger appetite. We need to move this whole industry up market. We can't just work on direct response only advertisers, whether or not we want to be in the outcomes business. And you just simply cannot win the trust and credibility of global blue chip companies if your only measurement is that we'll count your promo codes and you'll see how good it is. They need something that's more reliable than that. And so I think a lot of this is growing pains, and what got us here doesn't get us to the next phase of growth. And I think that we were able to skate by with what we had for a long time. But as the marketplace matures and the appetite for revenue matures, we have to get more sophisticated in our instrumentation.
I mean, some people would argue that radio has had virtually no comparable data for many years, but it seems to have done okay. It's still making much more money than podcasting is. So why should podcasting be, any different, I suppose?
I don't know that radio is really the model that we want to follow. I think that, it is, listen, I love radio. I spent the first decade of my career in radio. I know we all, most of us in this space had some version of that, but we did leave for a reason. And I think that everyone in the space would acknowledge it's an iceberg that is melting slowly, and it is likely not the future that anybody sees as being a rich opportunity. Yeah. So I just, I think the growth numbers that we've experienced as an industry are going to be hard to keep up with as we go into the future, and it's going to require some reinvention. What is your favorite podcast other than the Media Roundtable? Is it Joe Rogan, Call Her Daddy, Mel Robbins, Crime Junkie, Amy Poehler, Smartless, Pivot? What are you into? It's such an interesting dinner table topic to ask people. You learn a lot, and people are so passionate about this medium. They're so passionate about it. And where do you listen? Where do you watch? Is it YouTube? Is it Apple? Is it Spotify? You are in the center of what we do as an organization. That is our business. We are Oxford Road, and we help some of the leading brands in the world be successful advertising in these channels. We're the largest specialist that exists. We buy the most ads in this channel. So we are actually powering this industry. We buy over $500 million of ads per year for wonderful brands like Shopify, Wayfair, DraftKings, Masterclass, Chime, Quince, AG1, Mint Mobile. We're interrupting all your favorite podcasts, including not just the usual suspects, but there are thousands in the long tail that are great niche shows with really loyal audiences. And what happens is when you advertise there, the host really only gets to pick one in your category. And so if you're the first there, you can kind of lock up that relationship, that annuity, and be recommended to those audiences for years. So it's a powerful space. And it's one where we have the privilege of leading right now. We've got lots of great ways to de-risk our clients' campaigns, like our Orbit data set that's getting close to $2 billion of performance data. So we know what's going to work in advance. We also have Audiolytics, which are our proprietary ad grading system to make sure every word counts and is always getting optimized, and then de-risked through our brand safety taxonomy as well, to make sure we watch out for your brand values. If you want to win in this channel, and you've got something to say, you got a product worth talking about, and you want to get into this trust economy, and you're serious about it, you really want to be a part of it over the long haul, we'd love to talk to you. OxfordRoad.com. You can subscribe to our newsletter if you like free stuff. It's called The Influencer, and it's free. We also have a lot of good thought pieces if you want to learn at OxfordRoad.com. That is OxfordRoad.com.
So we've got definitions in this document. We've got definitions of plays and audiences and definitions of what a podcast is. I suspect that the headlines are going to be around the exposure metrics, the data that is being talked about in this document to help advertisers.
Chunk timestamp range, timestamp consumed, show and episode identifiers, user agent, from consenting users, IP address, and optionally, the mobile ad ID and a hashed email address.
There is a lot of data being asked for here, Giles, from podcast apps.
Yeah.
I'm curious, who has to do the majority of the work here in terms of making their stuff, for want of a better word, AMP certified?
Yeah, it's a great question. And when we put the technical guidance together for exposure metrics that was authored by Pete Bersinger of Podscribe, we were leaning quite heavily on HLS. It's interesting to see that seeming to get sort of more and more interest and adoption in the market, which is encouraging, for the work that we've done. But it was actually you, James, that highlighted to us that very first package of data that gets sent in the HLS stream is about a minute's worth of data. And so if with a 30-second standard, I think originally we were thinking that the hosting platforms would be able to do the job for us in terms of the 30-second chunking or whatever it might be. But, I think what you highlighted was that actually it's quite likely or even certain that the actual endpoint, players where the shows are actually consumed would be the ones that would eventually need to share that data with us for most precision, at least. So yes, there's nuance there that we didn't foresee at the time. And again, this is the type of thing that I think as an industry and, hopefully IAB, will get sort of deeper into and become more precise. But there may be some reliance on those players, and I think you've made some interesting observations about that.
There's data in here that you're wanting from players, things like user agents, which they already produce, IP addresses, which is a whole conversation that we could do 2 hours on, but also things like if people are opted in, mobile ad IDs and potentially hashed emails. Actually, that's something which is going on here in Australia, where we have a number of different radio and podcast apps who are all theoretically using the same type of identity. So you don't know who somebody is, but you do know that the same person that consumed this on this app is the same person as that's consumed that on that app. So, there is certainly stuff going on here. The aim in this document is for this data work to be achieved by the end of this year for all of the major players. So that's those who are above 1% of all consumption. How realistic do you think that is going to be?
I thought that we had sort of targeted some meaningful progress by the end of this year, but it allowed room for it.
Sorry, meaningful progress. Okay.
Because I think expecting the whole market to have moved by the end of this year, that's not my recollection of what we ended up with. I know that we were sort of targeting perhaps like one or more of the major platforms implementing some of this work. I think we had allowed for it to progress into 2027.
There's certainly quite a lot of work there in terms of making sure that the major players are all turned on. I mean, I guess, the difficult question is going to be, firstly, let me just backtrack slightly. Who was on the group from the podcast app developers?
Well, we had only major platforms represented, and I'm not sure even exactly who I can mention, Dan.
Well, I think, James, you've reported who we can mention, I believe. If you haven't reported them, that doesn't mean they weren't there, but it does mean we can't mention them.
Select AMP members include representatives from Oxford Road, Spotify, BetterHelp, DraftKings, United Talent Agency, Libsyn, and Podscribe.
It's been reported elsewhere that YouTube was on there, and I've got agreement from YouTube that they were, so that's a good thing. I guess the worry that I've got is we already know that Overcast, which is a major player, has 3+% of all podcast downloads, which are not the same as plays, but we know that Overcast won't implement any of this. We also know from history that Apple Podcasts is going to be very unlikely to be implementing a lot of what is being asked for here. Podcast Addict is one person, and so we need to work out whether that one person is going to be implementing this as well. I guess my question is, if more than half of all current podcast consumption won't implement this, what's the next step for where we go with this?
Well, I think that the push for better data and better metrics it's sort of an evolutionary thing, really. So, if this effort does not help deliver that, I think you will see parties in the industry, which would include Oxford Road, I'm sure, to continue their exploration for better data, and whatever that can be found. You have companies like Flightpath, who are building a sort of very interesting tech stack that, if people are hosting there, I think that there's going to be different levels of data available to those types of platforms and what at least we are typically used to seeing as an agency. Similar type of story with other companies that we're having conversations with and exploring, Podstock or Bump or whoever it might be. A new sort of era of data is appearing in a way, but it's sort of quite patchy still. But I think this is indicative of the type of evolution we're seeing. So that if we find that the players won't get on board, you sort of said over 50%. If the majority won't get on board, then maybe there are ways to work with them or to help incentivize them for this. But if we can't make that work, I think, again, like the evolution is inevitable. I can't guarantee what it's going to look like, but I think the pressure will continue.
James, just for my benefit, so basically your concern is that the way that we have described actually accessing impression data, exposure data, is outside of what you think will be compatible with Apple of all the main constituents we need to win over here?
I mean, I think the data that's being asked for is very non-Apple-y in terms of the data that would be sent back to publishers. But I guess on the other side, what we currently have in the AMP Accords is that we have a menu of all of the things that the AMP group would like. And it strikes me that actually there's probably conversations now, negotiations now in terms of, okay, this is all of the stuff that we would like. But what are you comfortable? Which of these things, of these menu items, are you comfortable in doing now? Are the things that we can do now, are the things that need to be pushed back because of legal concerns, because of privacy concerns, whatever that might be, so that we end up moving forward into a place where at least, I mean, for example, Apple's definition of a play, even if you're not getting direct data from Apple's definition of a play ends up being the same as Spotify's and the same as YouTube's. That would be super useful. And at the moment, Apple's definition of a play, well, I've been on record as saying it's useless because it doesn't measure anything like what anybody else is going to measure. And so I think this is a stepping stone document, isn't it, towards where we'll get to.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think Giles said it well, and I think he'll probably improve on what I'm about to try to say. But where our thinking was in this process was to say, all right, what do we think is the best case scenario that we could imagine haven't violated any lines in the sand of these players? We tried to do our best to say, how do we work within the art of the possible? And where have they said there's a red line here? We're not going to go over it. And let's try to accommodate that. Because if you don't have the big three on board, it's going to be really hard to do what we're trying to do, which is to say, basically, anything consistent is better than a good inconsistent one and a bad inconsistent one put together. So we tried to also define these things in such a way that if one of the key participants was not going to give us access to information we would need to fully execute, they would at least be able to give us access to information that was consistent with what we could get from the others, so that it matched, even if it needed to sit outside of the ideally blended, aggregated sources. We might get our information through a separate source and say, well, it's not as verifiable by a third party, or it has these limitations for whatever reasons, but at least we're using the same language and using the same, definitions. And then there's still questions of how many people's word do you have to take for it, that it's actually good.
Yeah. And of course, we are lucky in that we do have HLS data for some of the shows. That will be for more of the shows. And even if a certain amount gets pre-downloaded onto a device, you can still work out what a user has actually consumed from that. That's certainly a helpful step forward. So I think all of this is really useful, helpful steps towards something that isn't just a download where, frankly, we've got no idea of whether or not somebody has actually consumed that content, and somebody is paid to be in that content. Well, are people actually hearing their stuff? So I can totally see that there's real opportunity here. There's also data around attribution as well, and we're in a pretty good place in terms of attribution, I think, for podcasting anyway. In terms of the data that the AMP Accord talks about in terms of attribution, is there much more being talked about here that companies like Magellan AI, Podscribe, and others are already, are not doing already?
Yeah, there are definitely some developments, and I don't know if I would necessarily agree that we're in a good place as an industry on attribution. I think we've got a good infrastructure for pixels in place, but I think a lot of advertisers, at least, that we talk with, still question those results, quite regularly, and they still have to earn the trust, of a lot of buyers. And so what we are doing here is trying to put in place a set of attribution standards or capabilities that would do even better job at earning that trust or earning it more quickly. Part of the attribution proposals that we had sort of hinged on that prior exposure section, where we were looking to build the attribution not simply off a download, but off an actual consumption, and ideally a consumption of an actual ad, rather than simply just the first 30 seconds of playing an episode. So building that attribution of was the ad exposure actually verified? And then the other piece that I think is really important, and it has its own section in the document, was just about the use of control groups, and holding out a randomly selected group of users, which, gives you a sort of a control group against which to measure performance. And that's one of the ways that you can overcome that trust barrier much more quickly. And I think if people are able to implement that, and I've been given some encouragement about that, actually, that a lot of the hosting platforms should be able to implement that without too heavy a lift. So, we're somewhat optimistic about that one. And I think, but for people in the industry who are a bit further away from sort of the brands, we're very close to the brands, and we're sort of further away from some of those people who are doing all that, or would need to do like all that hard work, the engineers, and the players, or whatever it might be. They maybe don't see the importance of this type of rigor in the attribution space. And it's not the type of thing that, the IAB, at least in podcasting, have sort of thought much about before historically, I don't think, at least not to my knowledge. So, it's interesting sort of having a group like we did. Obviously, it's weaker in some areas because it represents the whole industry. And so there's not sort of the really strong technical focus that you would get with an IAB group, but it's a much broader sort of industry group. And we're sort of trying to bring to market the awareness of, like, if we can crank up the robustness, the quality, the trust in the attribution area, like, that's really an area where we can unlock potentially a lot more spend for the industry. And people sometimes ask, like, who stands to benefit from all of this? But really, like, if the advertiser spend can start flowing in because there's more confidence in the ROI of the platform, that really should benefit everybody. And, Dan's been very vocal about that. And there's not really a special interest group there. I mean, yes, it can benefit us and Oxford Road, but it benefits our clients and the brands that are spending. It benefits the creators. It benefits the hosting platforms. You mentioned the players, and like, I think you've given us a great challenge when we talk privately about this, that there could be a real opportunity to bring some benefit to them as well. And I think that's very much the sort of mindset that we've tried to bring. It's like we think that there's opportunity for the whole industry here, and I hope that we'll be able to find a way for that to really happen.
Just going back to the premise of the question, I think that through pixeling the Magellans and the Podscribes and the Claritoses, I think that the industry got very comfortable with that being a standard way to measure, even though it can be arduous and there's a lot of ways to get it wrong. And, you really have to work at it. But I think it was pretty good we had a moment in time when we were kind of settled, right? And then YouTube starts becoming an X factor that just takes everybody out at the knees, because suddenly it's incompatible and your instrumentation is not working for a large part of the audience you're buying. You just don't know how much. And so I think that forced us to have to say, there has to be a bit of reinvention to deal with the video component.
Yeah, you can well see that. So it is a really detailed piece of work. It's a piece of work which I don't envy anybody putting together. Dan, you posted something on LinkedIn last week where you were basically saying, we're going to be publishing this thing. Not everybody's going to like it. Even I don't like it. Why did you say that?
It probably goes back to family of origin issues that I need to work out in therapy. But I think, and how much time we've given to this thing. But no, truly, it's been a labor of love. And, the AMP Accords don't happen if it weren't for a few people. And Giles is first on that list. Because we did need somebody that actually knows what they're talking about or sounds like they do. And he is certainly all of those things.
I sound like I do.
It doesn't hurt. Either way, I think people worked really hard on it. And, it's like, well, should it be 30 seconds or 60 seconds? Well, I think it should be 60 seconds, right? But it doesn't matter what I think. Really, I think for e-commerce, you really need to we need to abolish vanity URLs, and we need surveys and second layer surveys with auto-populated predictive text. And you can do holdouts from that. Like, I think there's different ways of achieving some of the objectives we're trying to achieve. And at the end of the day, who cares what I think? I think that what matters is that we have a standard that everybody can deal with, because what's happened is there's been this great fragmentation in media and with society and culture and everything, but there's a great manifestation in media and in our business where everybody has gone their own way and built these islands that speak a different language. And if we want to cooperate in any way for our mutual benefit and mutual gain, we need a common language. And, the fact that one of them rolls their tongue and I can't roll my tongue doesn't really matter. At some point, we just have to pick a language and go, or else we're going to keep talking about it and we're going to be frustrated. And we're going to have, we got the greatest thing in the world with this podcast medium. It is truly like the shining city on a hill as far as media goes. And we can't get out of our own frickin' way to actually to not spike our customers' tires when they drive into the parking lot. It's like, let's make it a little easier and friendlier to do business, whether or not it satisfies my personal preferences. And if everybody says that, we might get somewhere.
Agreed. Consistency is a wonderful thing. Where can we go to learn more?
Ampaccords.com. That is ampaccords.com. Promo code.
We don't do those anymore. We don't do those anymore. And of course, there's the Media Roundtable podcast, which is a good podcast to go and learn.
Oh, thank you.
More about everything that you folks do as well. Giles and Dan, thank you, and many congratulations on this work.
Thank you, James. Thanks for helping. Well, special thank you to James Cridland of Pod News and the Podcast Business Journal. And thank you for Giles for joining me. And everyone on the task force who put months into this. We've kind of said the names of everybody that's able to go on record who is part of this task force. We've also had a lot of people in the industry that have helped give this a look, give us feedback, and help make this thing a bit more durable. If you take anything away, just remember standards aren't necessarily glamorous. It's not the sexiest thing that you can work on in entertainment or content products. But you can't have a real industry if nobody agrees on standards. And we tried not to let perfect be the enemy of good. And we think we've got something here that is as good as it can be for all major stakeholder groups in this industry. So we hope you check it out. Go to ampaccords.com, ampaccords.com. And by the way, this podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road. And we don't want you just to succeed in this medium. We want you to use your influence for good. reach out to us if you want a little help aligning your brand values with extraordinary business outcomes. Go to oxfordroad.com. Subscribe to our newsletter. It's free. It's called The Influencer. Reminds you to listen to this podcast and gives you a little recap of what we cover every week. You can always give us feedback at info@mediaroundtable.com. And special thank you to Haley, Bianca, Rocio, Kyle, Ezra, Paulina, Everett, Neil, Brian, and the team at Podcast One. As always, influence responsibly.